Welcome, everyone. My name is Scott Barrett. I'm a professor in SEPA and the Earth Institute, and I am joined by my co-host, Jeffrey Sachs, university professor at Columbia University, and Yanis Bennett-Moore, who is the executive director of the Center for Sustainable Development and adjunct professor in SEPA. And our webinar series is called COVID-19, Policymaking in the Throes of a Global Crisis. And we're actually in the throes of, I would say, global crises. There's so many things happening. So we're on a wild ride. One of the critical areas, of course, that we've all been concerned about is innovation leading to therapeutic treatments for COVID-19 and also vaccines. And of course, just in the last few days, we've had some very positive news on the vaccine front. So all of this is perfect timing for today's speaker, Professor Bhaven Sampat, who's an associate professor in public health and health policy and management in the Mailman School of Public Health. He's an economist who specializes in political economy of science and technology, especially in the life sciences. And he studied such perspectives as the role of government in innovation, the distribution of innovative products worldwide, and the incentives for innovation through the global patent system, and some other work recent that's very critical for us, which is crisis innovation, drawing lessons from previous experiences, particularly involving World War II, moment of crisis and need for collective action. So very similar in those general ways from the current situation. So Bhaven, thank you so much for joining us. We're going to ask you to speak for around 20 minutes or so, and then we'll open it up for some questions. We have a number of students who are participating as independent study students, and they'll send us some questions. There'll be other people in the audience, and they'll also send us some questions. And Andrew Wilson will work with me to identify some questions to ask later on. So thank you so much for joining us, and over to you.
Very good. Well, thank you, Scott, Jeff, Yanis, Andrew, for having me. I'm going to try to share my screen here, which is going to be the hardest part of all this. But I think it will work if past is prologue. Can you give me a thumbs up if you see something that approximates a shared screen? Very good, thanks. So yeah, so contrary to my usual just-in-time approach, I actually prepared this presentation last week based on an article I did with Ken Shadlin, who's a political scientist in the International Development Department at LSE. We wrote that a few weeks ago, but I suppose no good deed goes unpunished. It turns out that a lot has changed since this time last week, including, among other things, as Scott pointed out, some preliminary good news on Pfizer's vaccine candidate, which actually complicates the story that I'm going to tell, and I'll come back to that at the end because I think it complicates it in interesting ways. But before talking about that, I want to just start with a broad overview of the novel aspects of what I'll call the COVID vaccine innovation system, at least as Ken and I understand it, and some of the new questions it raises for innovation policy in the pandemic, but also potentially beyond. So before talking about COVID, let me do a little bit of stage setting here. Here's a chart from Hamilton Moses and colleagues that was published in JAMA in 2015. I don't have more updated figures, but the basic shares are approximately the same, and it shows by funder total US biomedical R&D funding. And what you'll see there is that it is dominated by private sector firms, pharma, biotech, and device firms. But the biggest single funder, I think the biggest single funder of research in the world, maybe the universe, as far as we know, is the NIH, the National Institutes of Health, a health and human services agency that supports biomedical research in the US. And at least at a 20,000 foot level, and I'm going to do a bit of a quick caricature here, but hopefully not too gross of one, there's a rough division of labor. And so if we think about 2019, where the public sector through the NIH disproportionately funds quote unquote basic research, and we rely on the private sector to do the costly development and trials, incentivized by profits, typically protected by patents, which matter more in life sciences than they do in other fields. But that's the basic picture of the system, say circa 2019. And importantly, very little explicit focus on diffusion in biomedical innovation policy to the, and this is something that I and others have complained about over the years. It's the kind of basic research side that's viewed as hard, and also very little coordination along the chain. So there's very little explicit government coordination of the different actors involved. Okay, so that's the setup. Again, a bit of a caricature, but basically right. As we know, we've seen an unprecedented R&D response to COVID, and we've seen what I think is remarkable progress, so it seems, in a relatively short period of time, much more so than people like me expected 6 years ago, 6 months ago, and 6 years ago. But if you stared at one of the many treatment and vaccine trackers out there, and you focused on the US actors, so I think China and Russia and other places are a bit different, but if you focused on the US actors, you would be excused for thinking that it's basically the same system, in the sense that it's mostly private sector firms that are involved in the late stage development, at least nominally. But what I'm going to argue and show you is that's not true, and that we see new government funding mechanisms operating in very different ways than we did in the innovation system pre-COVID, and in ways that raise interesting new issues and potentially problems. And I'm going to call these push mechanisms, and this just means public funding for research. And again, pre-COVID, the main push mechanism was NIH funding of upstream or basic research. So the first thing to say about the push response, the push R&D response, is that it's actually been quite small relative to what economists suggested it should be. So this is a chart I took from the Washington Post. My slides seem to blur into each other. That's okay. And through a series of supplementals and other appropriations, we spent about $4 trillion on the COVID response since March. Of that, $14 billion has been spent for vaccine treatment and development. So as the arrow points to, a very small share of the overall response, which is arguably quite too small, way too small, given that we're sort of in a nation turns its lonely eyes to you type situation, especially with respect to a vaccine, in a context where we're losing $10 billion a day in global GDP. So it's smaller than a lot of people wanted. Second, it's going through different sources. It's not primarily going through what we've thought of as the crown jewel of the federal R&D establishment, the NIH. The NIH did get some money and also repurposed some of its money early on, and indeed early on had plans to coordinate the research effort, especially with respect to vaccines. But those were superseded in April with the announcement of Operation Warp Speed, whereas the NIH approach was focused on global cooperation and pooling of resources and things like that. Warp Speed is explicitly an America First approach that has this audacious goal of developing a vaccine and securing 300 million doses for Americans by January 2021. And as this chart shows, most of the funding, most of the COVID funding has gone not through NIH, but through another HHS agency that many of us had not even really heard of, or certainly not paid attention to before this year, BARDA, the Biomedical Advanced Research and Development Authority. And you'll see here that disproportionately, the BARDA funding is focused on vaccines rather than treatments, a point which we can come back to in a bit. So the other thing about BARDA with respect as compared to NIH is that BARDA contracts are super secret, and even when you can get them through FOIA and whatnot, half of them are redacted and they're really hard to understand. So we've gone through the process of just trying to get our hands on these things and try to understand what each of these contracts are doing. On the vaccine slide, which I'll focus on for this slide, as far as we can tell, BARDA has contracts with 7 vaccine firms, and these are the rows of this chart, to the tune of about, I think about $12 billion or so far. But the other thing to note is the columns of this chart. BARDA funding is not for quote unquote basic research. BARDA push funding is for things like development, late stage clinical trials, manufacturing, including manufacturing at risk. So, building up manufacturing capacity in private sector firms before anything is even approved. And then procurement, which is actually more like pull than push, which so I'll get back to that a bit later on. But the point is that, as they used to say, this is not your father's Oldsmobile, right? This is a very different role for public sector push funding than in normal times, much more direct funding and subsidy of downstream activities. One thing, if you're looking closely, you may note is that one of these firms is not like the other. So you see Pfizer, which is the penultimate row here, and you'll see that Pfizer actually only, as far as we can tell, and again, the data are murky, but as far as we can tell, only has a procurement contract. So Pfizer famously, at least as of this week, famously did not accept warp speed funding for manufacturing, for clinical trials, and things like that. It does have a procurement contract through BARDA, and that's a point that I'll get back to a little bit later on. Okay, and there's a lot of words on this slide, so maybe I'll just let me just summarize that. If I gave I was critical of BARDA because it's hard to get our hands on data on what's actually doing. If I give BARDA a C, the rest of the world actually gets a D- for transparency. It's actually quite difficult to learn from different global funding agencies or even foundations exactly what they're spending and on what. And so we've gone through this exercise of piecing things together from the various imperfect databases and funding announcements and press releases and things like that. I think there's 3 key points to make here, the punchlines here. First, it seems indisputable that the US is by far the largest global push funder. There's individual countries that are involved at the $1 billion range or so, but the US conservatively is spending 5 times more than any other individual country, and much more than the EU is as well. Second, there is also an organization that's worth watching, CEPI, the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness Innovation, which is it's got its own portfolio of vaccines, about $1 billion, that overlaps with, but doesn't perfectly overlap with the warp speed vaccines. And that's important because it's tied up with some global procurement efforts, which I'll talk about in a minute. But perhaps most importantly, as far as we can tell, in all places where we have information, other countries too are primarily involved in funding things like development, late stage trials, and manufacturing, and other countries are also heavily focused on vaccines and not so much on treatments. Okay, so that's the new push mechanisms, the new push landscape. Let me turn now to the pull mechanisms, which are different from push mechanisms. So if push subsidizes research inputs, pull approaches instead reward successful development of specific products. And the main pull mechanism, as I mentioned at the beginning of this discussion, the main pull mechanism in the US biomedical research system pre-COVID was the patent system or patent policy. And patents fund R&D through the prospect of monopoly prices, and they have this kind of well-known problem because they essentially can thus create problems for access and affordability, even if they are stimulating innovation. So patents have this trade-off between what we economists call dynamic and static efficiency. Partly in response to that, partly for other reasons, in the 1990s and 2000s, Michael Kramer and other economists reintroduced this idea that maybe we want other mechanisms, including prizes and advanced market commitments, instead to fund R&Ds. And a lot of that discussion was explicitly focused on vaccines, especially vaccines for neglected tropical diseases. I won't say too much about that, but those are contexts where it may not be feasible or desirable to finance R&D through patents, and there was an exploration of other sorts of approaches. Carrying on that conversation, it's not surprising that at the beginning of the pandemic, there were a number of proposals for advanced market commitments from economists, legal scholars, and others to the tune of $70 to $100 billion for a COVID vaccine. There was actually much less discussion of AMCs and prizes for treatments. So have we done that? The answer is no. We haven't done that. An interesting question is if there's still scope or a need to do that. What we have done instead is these advanced procurement agreements. So this is the same chart that I showed you earlier from BARDA. And if you look at the rightmost column, as part of these contracts, sometimes as part of the same push contracts, the US government is buying up a set amount of doses, basically, and has the option of buying additional doses. So to read it out to you, I'll pick an interesting one, the Janssen, which is also a Johnson & Johnson contract. In addition to the funding it's giving for development trials and manufacturing, it's saying as part of this $1.5 billion, the US government gets 100 million doses and has the option to buy up to 300 million doses, right? So, so those are advanced purchase contracts, but essentially agreements with specific producers, not like these market-wide advanced market commitments that Kramer and others had proposed for vaccines initially and even at the beginning of this pandemic. What the US is doing is actually, you have to think about it in global context as well. The US is buying up doses from all of the leading vaccine manufacturers, most of them actually, not all of them, not from China or Russia, but it is in competition with other countries that are securing bilateral agreements to try to basically compete for the same stock of supply, in a phenomenon that has been described pejoratively, I think, pejoratively by most as vaccine nationalism. So there's a sort of scramble to get these doses. What's missing from this chart, which I took from the Wall Street Journal, is COVAX. And I won't say too much about this other than COVAX is the WHO and Gavi's pooled purchasing arm. It's sort of the pull counterpart to CEPI's push. And COVAX is trying to pool global demand for a diversified set of vaccines. And also, so it actually wants, at least originally wanted rich countries to buy their vaccines through COVAX rather than through bilateral deals. And also is trying to get development assistance and donor funding to support purchasing doses for developing countries to be able to cover 20% of their population the last time I looked. Thus far, it's having difficulty in doing both. And in particular, it's getting elbowed out by some of the rich countries in securing contracts with some of the leading vaccine manufacturers. And we can come back to that. Okay, so this seems different from textbook AMCs or prizes, as I've talked about. They're as much about securing doses as incentivizing innovation. They're producer specific, not market-wide, which raises a number of interesting questions. What I want to talk about next, and I think conclude with before we open it up to, actually, I'll talk about that and Pfizer next, and then maybe we can open it up to Q&A. What about the standard pull instrument, patents? There certainly has been a lot of discussion about patent policy since the beginning of the pandemic. And along similar lines to some of the patent policy discussion we were hearing in the drug price debates of 2019, just last year, that patents are the source of high prices. The government actually may own a lot of these patents, and we may be able to exercise things like march-in rights and things like that to leverage government ownership to bring prices down. There's also a continuation of a lot of the discussion in the global access to medicines movement around HIV/AIDS, which relied on circumventing patents or restricting the grant of certain types of patents to promote generic competition, particularly in India, and scale up a production for much of the developing world. So there's talk of compulsory licensing, patent pooling, and whatnot. And all this has been part of the discussion around COVID treatments and vaccines both. I actually, and I study patents. I spend a lot of time studying patents. I think there's an important point here that's missing. This is my one piece of data here, my one chart that I didn't steal from somebody else. This chart shows just on a database, a bibliometric database. I did a search for COVID vaccine patents and publications. And publications is the top line and kind of follows the trend. This is over the course of 2020, and it follows the trend I think you might expect, of skyrocketing of publications. You don't see much in the way, it's not zero, but it looks like zero in the way of patent application activity. It is not the case, I'm going to use a double negative here, it is not the case that firms aren't filing for patents on the research they're doing, including warp speed firms. Rather, patent applications are not published until 18 months after filing. So the stuff that was filed in March of 2020, it's not going to be published until the end of 2021, and then it's going to take a couple of years to grant. So these patents will hit in 2022, 2023, or something like that. It's not my sense that these are, for that reason, I don't know that they're actually providing much in the way of pull incentives going forward. There's just a lot of uncertainty about whether and when they'll issue, but also who owns competing claims and whatnot. I just don't think that patents matter all that much on the innovation side here, with one exception. I actually think I don't think patents tomorrow matter that much. I actually think patents yesterday might matter. So pre-existing patents, including on mRNA platforms, including NIH patents on the spike proteins, including some of AstraZeneca's patents on vaccine delivery systems, the pre-existing patents may actually matter a little bit more, and that's something I'm exploring in empirical research. But the other thing to note about patents is they also don't matter on the access side as much. So as I mentioned, this is a hypothesis, but this is kind of currently how I feel about this. With HIV/AIDS drugs, with small molecule drugs, if you got rid of patents, you could get a number of sophisticated Indian generic producers to come into the market and basically scale up. For a number of the complicated treatments, monoclonal antibodies, things like that, and certainly for vaccines, based on what we know, imitation, even absent patents, is a very, very hard thing to do. So just getting rid of the patents is not going to be enough. And so I think that leads us to, if the problem of the day is how to get to 14 billion doses, so 2 billion per person, at affordable prices, I don't think just circumventing patents will be sufficient. And this question of whether it's actually necessary. But instead, we have to go back to thinking about policies and institutions for scale up international knowledge and technology transfer, stuff that frankly we haven't really thought about much in biomedical innovation policy for many years. Okay, I have some sort of rote conclusions here, but actually I think it's kind of too early to conclude anything beyond what I've already said. I think this is a very different innovation system than in normal times, along the lines I've already talked about. But if I may, Scott, if I could just take 2 minutes to conclude and just reflect on the recent Pfizer news. Because as I mentioned, it does sort of seemingly complicate the story that I've told, that the system is operating very differently from what it did in 2019. So here's what I understand about the recent Pfizer news. So, sneak peek suggests that the vaccine is 90% effective. That's probably going to come down a little bit, but it's very good news. And it's good news not only for Pfizer, or maybe not even mainly for Pfizer, but for the crowd, because it's proof of concept that targeting the spike protein, which interestingly I think all of the warp speed vaccines do, is feasible, or is likely to work, and it's also a proof of concept for perhaps mRNA. There's still a lot of questions, and I think it's too soon to celebrate anything yet. There's still a lot of questions on exactly what it's going to do and what it's going to prevent, and I think all of those things we need to keep in mind. But what's interesting is this. As I pointed out, Pfizer it was funny at the time, the CEO in April or May said warp speed is too slow for us. We don't want to deal with government money. And so we're not going to be accepting the government contracts for manufacturing scale up and things like that. We're going to go it alone. And as far as we can tell, the main thing that warp speed has done for Pfizer is basically just this procurement contract that I mentioned earlier. There is apparently some small public funding through the German government for Pfizer's partner BioNTech, and perhaps the public sector owns some of the key IP as well. And those are some themes that we'll be seeing discussed going forward, I suspect. Pfizer is also interesting because it's taken a sort of middle ground on pricing. And I think, again, all of this needs to be contextualized against just the reputation of the pharmaceutical industry in 2019, right? Which was, it was kind of getting beat up in the halls of Congress, rightly or wrongly, for profiteering. And a number of firms have said that we're not going to try to make a profit off of these investments during the course of the pandemic, whatever that might mean. Pfizer has explicitly said no. This is a big commercial opportunity, but it would be unethical essentially to price gouge. So they're going to do something in between. It looks like right now for industrialized countries, we're talking about $20 per dose, which, if you do the math, ends up being like Lipitor numbers. This could be a very lucrative drug for Pfizer, though I think the profits will be realized over a relatively short period of time. As with other vaccines, it looks like, as far as we can tell, 80% of the Pfizer doses based on projected capacity to the end of 2021 are already spoken for, almost half by the US, which I think raises an interesting set of issues I've already alluded to. So where do I land on this? And I'm still trying to figure out my thoughts on the news of the week. Even if it proves successful, unless Pfizer is able to, figure out a way to scale up or has the incentives to scale up rapidly, it's not going to be enough. We're going to need more. We're going to need more vaccines. And so, in a sense, the best news for me from that perspective is the fact that we've got a strong signal of feasibility of the rest of the vaccines that are out there being developed. Because I think in order to satisfy global demand, we're gonna need a lot more. We're gonna need a lot more vaccine. But, and I'll end here, we saw the production limits of facing Pfizer. I showed you the production limits and the scramble for supply for the other firms. To me, the innovation policy problem of the time is getting to 14 billion doses. How do we scale up? And that's very different from the innovation system circa 2019, where the big problem was how do we come, the invention side of things. I think once again, diffusion, scale up, distribution is front and center as something that needs to be thought about in science and technology policy. So why don't I leave it at that and look forward to the discussion and any questions you may have.
Alvin, that was just brilliant. Really terrific presentation. A lot of information packed into a very short period of time. So I'm still trying to absorb it all. I guess the big question I have, so this whole arrangement, we were thrown into a crisis and we decided not to do it in the conventional way, which is fair enough because it wasn't a conventional situation. So it was an emergency situation. And the result in terms of innovation at this point has to be looked at as being successful. I mean, was it perfect? That's a different question. But to get a vaccine with this, I'm not sure what we're going to learn in the future about this vaccine, the Pfizer vaccine, but 90% efficacy is pretty astonishing. That's definitely at the high end of any estimates that I had heard of before. So on the innovation front, and that's just the first, right? We're going to see more coming in later. On the innovation front, it seems like there's a success. I think the other side to this, as you're saying, that's so critical is distribution and the rents of all this. So on the distribution front, that was one of the areas where, as you said, COVAX, was quite keen to make sure that we treat a global pandemic as a global problem and give priorities in terms of distribution as we wait for production to ramp up. to where it's going to have the biggest effect globally in reducing mortality. And that's more or less the idea. It sounds like if we had used the old model, the NIH kind of model, you said that that had a more of a global perspective. So if we had gone that route, maybe it would have been as fast, maybe it wouldn't have been as fast on the development front, but it would have had a very different complexion in terms of distribution. And as you say, this America First, which has only inspired other countries to pretty much do more or less the same, with the exception of the COVAX. So there's some differences, but I think US leadership here basically invited other countries to behave in the same way. And it seems to me that that's something that's pretty important, because this was, you could have looked at this as an opportunity for the world to come together and say, we have a common problem, let's deal with it together. And for the US, I mean, that would have been like a major opportunity for the US to, in everyone's eyes, to be seen as a country that is, you know, has a moral motivation for its actions, that is a leader, and that would pay off in turn in all sorts of other ways in the future. And now we lose all of that. So there's none of that in the current arrangement as I see it. So how do you see, we stand back and try to evaluate what we've done? Is it true that on the development side, innovation development, that's been a success? The distribution side, still a little unclear about how that's going to roll out, but that ultimately that's going to be a missed, that could be, that maybe that's where the error is more on that side. And then finally, you know, the money. If there's all this public money, okay, Pfizer sort of opted not to take it, but making money off of this, I think, is going to be a PR problem for any pharmaceutical company. Maybe I'm wrong. They seem not to be so worried about that most of the time.
Yeah.
But you know, another, just the last thing I'll say, another episode in history in which there was a race for a vaccine was the epidemic of polio in the 1950s. And there you had the first vaccine developed by Jonas Salk. And when he was asked about, is there going to be a patent on the vaccine, he said something like, why would you patent the sun? Like, it was something that was so much a public good. Like, why would you even think about that? And I know we're in a different world now. That research wasn't even funded through the NIH. It was mainly through the that voluntary contributions. But anyway, I'll just leave it there. I've been rambling a little bit, but I think there's a central issue about distribution, particularly globally, number one, and number two, the rent seeking around this.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so all very important questions. Let me just on the Salk anecdote. It turns out that Salk actually there's a little bit of a PR around this. He actually explored the idea of filing a patent, but they told him that he couldn't. His lawyers at the National Infantile Paralysis Society, they told him that he couldn't, and so he did. So I just read a book about that, so I thought I'd mention it.
Interesting.
Yeah, so I should clarify that the original NIH approach, I think it was called Active or something like that. It was about, you know, nobody was thinking about distribution at the time, 6 months ago. It was about collaboration in research space. It was about, you know, let's see what the Chinese are doing. Let's see what people are doing globally, and let's coordinate with them. So, you know, in econ speak, we can optimally diversify our portfolios. We can share information and whatnot. And so it was in that sense that it was global. It was meant to be global. And again, there was no plan. It was just kind of what Francis Collins said. But it seems like that was at least the approach, that let's use global science to tackle this problem. And that hasn't happened, except at maybe an individual level, but that hasn't happened institutionally for sure. Yet we've seen, as you point out, you know, counterfactuals are hard, but we've seen what looks like remarkable progress that exceeds at least our early expectations. And so yeah, I mean, what does that tell us? I mean, I'm trying to understand that a little bit. I mean, one thing it does point to, I think, is just for lack of a better word, the resilience of the innovation system. I mean, we weren't explicitly prepared for this, right? We weren't explicitly prepared for this. And suffice it to say, political leadership around this has not been great. And yet, right? And so the story is not over by any means, but it is quite, at least the progress to getting a vaccine. It's just, if you believe the numbers, it seems quite remarkable. I don't think that all is lost, because on the prospects of global cooperation, and you obviously know much more about this than I do, but the next hard problem is manufacturing and then distribution, and it seems like there is scope, right? So let's imagine, and I don't know if it has to be COVAX or someone else, but let's imagine that we committed to a large market commitment for purchasing for developing countries and for funding the manufacturing capability to do that. I mean, we could still do that, right, if there was the money and the political will to do that. So I don't know that the door is closed on that.
If I just interrupt on that one point. So when
Yeah.
I looked briefly at the COVAX arrangement, and I was
Yeah.
a little surprised that there was this emphasis on all these purchases. And because one of the things that has been very effective globally has been the compulsory licensing you mentioned, where
Yeah.
you can get the manufacturers. So as long as the product can be produced in developing countries,
Yes.
they should be able to produce it. It won't be $20 a dose. What'll be,
Yeah.
maybe $1 less. I don't know what it's going to be, but that by itself would probably be just enormously successful. It lacks what I would like to see, something about solidarity in bringing this outcome about, but it has the attraction of unleashing the capacity in a lot of these developing countries to manufacture and to distribute.
I'm actually bearish that can happen. Partly, so it really depends. So how hard these things are to produce. If it is the case that you need not just the intellectual property, like getting rid of the patent, but you need complementary tacit knowledge, you need complementary know-how. You can't, compulsory license, you can't force Pfizer to share their tacit knowledge, right? I mean, it's hard to contract on that. It's hard to compel people to do that, so firms to do that. And so I think for some of the therapies, you will see compulsory licensing, especially for the small molecule therapies. But I'm not sure that we're going to be able to do so quickly through compulsory licensing for the vaccines, despite the fact that there are some sophisticated producers, the Serum Institute in India. I mean, I think the most prominent among them. I don't know that it's going to be that easy. Yeah.
Can I interject here? Because actually the Serum Institute in India has made at least 2 licenses that I know about. Definitely AstraZeneca.
Voluntary licenses. Yeah.
Okay, but we also had a speaker 3 weeks ago who was talking about vaccine, and he's also developing a vaccine at Baylor, and he also has a partnership with Serum Institute. So the ideas are there. I don't think that the pharmaceutical companies that are producing them, they are aware that they won't be able to produce in their current manufacturing. And so the idea of having partnerships in China, in Russia, in Brazil, in South Africa, etc., they are being explored.
Yeah, so I think there's variation. So I think AstraZeneca certainly has been kind of looking around to try to use contracts or use partners to scale up. Pfizer, interestingly, is basically said they're going it alone, right? Like they've taken a go it alone type of approach, yeah, at least so far. So we'll see, yeah. And as I understand it, the AstraZeneca, my co-author Ken Shadlin's the expert on this, so I don't really want to. I'm just channeling what I think I've heard from him. AstraZeneca is producing what AstraZeneca wants to produce in Brazil, and there's no real I think the Brazilians are quite concerned that there's no real technology transfer or anything like that that's going to let them do anything beyond what AstraZeneca actually wants to do. Yeah, so
Jeff, I'm guessing you might have a question or two.
Yeah, thanks a lot for the presentation. I think, by the way, the capacity issue is a very real issue. It's not in the time horizon that we're talking about. There just isn't production capacity in most of the developing countries. So patent or not patent, this was a point of Peter Hotez quite strongly, that the real scale-up capacities are very limited in most of the developing world. Bhaven, I wonder whether you have information about China's and Russia's vaccines. Also, I'd just like clarification. What does it mean 90% effective? What is that statistic? Is that a comparison of the control group infection rate with the inoculated infection rate, or treatment group, or what is that supposed to mean? Because I haven't seen a clear scientific description of that number. I also wanted to ask you what this pricing is based on, this $20. Is that a lot, a little? And how come, if everything is paid for by the government, basically, that's also not a matter of policy discussion, as opposed to companies just announcing what their prices are. Final point for the historical record: the advanced market commitment was my idea, actually, just to note. And I brought Michael Kramer to a dinner where we talked about malaria as the case. That's where it originated when I was working on malaria back in 1998, 1999. He took it and did nice things with it afterwards, but I just want to set the record straight on that.
Duly noted. Yeah, and that's not surprising. Let me try to let's think. The 90% effective. Maybe Giannis actually more on this than I do. So maybe I'll punt that question to Giannis and take the others first. Does that make sense? Yeah. So yeah, on the where does the price come from? I think it's an interesting question. By the way, if it was, like value based, it would be much higher than $20.
It could be, right? Yeah, like absolutely. I'm just wondering how this emerges.
Yeah, so it's tricky in this case because it's division in some sense, right? Like it's part of a procurement contract that includes some funding for manufacturing and all this other stuff. So we're paying AstraZeneca, X billion dollars, and we're getting this many doses, and you divide, and it's about this much per dose, and then that becomes a kind of anchoring point for later discussions in some sense. So there's no real science to that. What is interesting is this. If you go back to last year, the drug price debates, there were a number of people saying that the drug companies shouldn't charge that much because the public sector is actually doing all the work. And I actually, I've done some research on this. That that's not typically the case, right? That's sometimes the case. That's not typically the case. It's the case for about 1 in 5 small molecule drugs, 1 in 5 important small molecule drugs. But typically it's the private sector doing the trials and whatnot. And so I push back a little bit against that narrative. Now, the government's doing the work, right? Like aside from Pfizer, the government's doing a lot of the downstream work. And I mentioned that the BARDA contracts are super secret. They've also been going through something called Other Transaction Authority, which is a contracting authority that allows them to circumvent some of the things like march-in rights and other approaches to leveraging government ownership to affect prices. And so I think a decision has been made, and I use the passive voice there, that there's not going to be any explicit attempt to try to leverage the government role to have some control over prices, or even ask the question about pricing. It's not clear to me that that's not that one couldn't review that decision at that point, at this point. But it's pretty clear that for many of the vaccines, including, notwithstanding what happens to vaccines, many of the vaccines that ultimately will need, that the government has played a very important, not just indirect role, but direct role in contrast to the way that the public and private sector interacted in the status quo ante. So Giannis, maybe you can answer the harder question.
I don't think it's a harder question. So the way that this was done is Pfizer enrolled around 43,000. They assigned them in a 1-to-1 vaccine versus placebo. And then they calculated that when they get to 150 infections, they'll be able to look at how many were in the control and how many were in placebo and how many were in the vaccinated. And they realized with a formula, 1 minus occurrence in control versus vaccinated, that in fact there are many more in the control than in the vaccinated. And so that's how they were able to calculate the 90% efficacy. So it's the way that they powered the study that allowed them to stop at 150 occurrences of infections. And then they looked how they were distributed between control and vaccinated, and most of them happen in the control. So they now have to wait 2 more months to see, but actually Bhaven has described that. They have to wait for 2 more months to see how this evolves. And they're going to follow all of the patients for 2 more years to see how long they are protected, etc.
But basically, it's saying that the rate of infection in the treatment group was 1/10 the rate of infection in the.
That's correct.
In the placebo group. Okay. But does anybody have word about? I mean, the Russian press release today said 92% effective for their Sputnik vaccine, which could very well be true. And probably easier to deliver, not a minus 70 degrees C cold chain.
Yep. I don't. Actually, I didn't answer that part of the question, Jeff. I mean, so on the funding side, we know that China and Russia actually account for a large share of the vaccines in late stage trials, and we tried really hard to figure out funding, but it just wasn't easy to do.
All government, you assume?
Yeah, yeah. So no, levels, not composition. But yes, yes, I think absolutely all government. Yeah. I only read the press. I only read the press release that you read this morning. Yeah, I mean it's 20. It looks like it's based on 20 patients.
Okay.
So it looks like it's pretty early. Though, as I understand it, the groups doing this work are quite sophisticated. And as you say, there are kind of deeper questions about, I'm thinking back to some of the old literature on appropriate innovation, right? There's deeper questions about whether, we want to put all our resources in a vaccine that's going to be really hard to distribute in much of the world, or maybe something with less efficacy or whatever. We don't even know that yet, that actually is in certain ways easier to scale up. And we haven't thought about that, partly because we don't think about diffusion that much, but I think we have to now, yeah.
Well, we should. I mean, that's, you can't really speak about efficiency without that. So actually that raises a cynical question I have, which is, are any of these companies, I'm thinking particularly of Pfizer, are they, these different strategies they had for vaccine design, some of them are easier to manufacture than others, particularly given existing capacity. Would a company choose, if it's worried about compulsory licensing, the obvious way for them to have control over the market, as it were, in some general sense, is to focus their innovation towards technologies that other countries don't have access for production. So they're kind of doing a backdoor patent arrangement to get around that constraint. Is that possible?
Yeah, I don't know in this case. I mean, I think they were following. I think the scientific opportunity probably pushed them quite a bit into choosing what they chose. But yeah, as a general point, absolutely. As a general point, absolutely. So maybe one way to say it is, so I think you're absolutely right that this kind of tacit knowledge and these non-patent barriers to exclusivity, I think are quite important. I think that's actually more of an issue on the therapeutic side in some sense, where firms are going after things. There's a big issue with forget about hydroxychloroquine, which is, but there's a big issue about whether we're putting nearly enough resources into repurposing old drugs, which aside from maybe the UK and maybe Gates, there's not a ton of, but it seems like we spent a lot of our money on vaccines and whatnot. But the reason I brought it up in the context of your comment is the patent issues are quite important there. I think it is my hypothesis that firms, right, certainly aren't going after things where there's limited patent protection at this point, and which would suggest that maybe the public sector should step in and be funding this kind of stuff. Yeah. So.
Completely. Yeah. So there's a question that is coming from Andrew and one of the students. I could ask it, but Andrew, would you rather ask it? So
yeah,
Andrew Wilson is in the control booth here. He's got command over over all of us.
Yeah, so just a couple of technical things. So one thing, I'm looking at the slide you have on BARDA's funding, and it looks like, so Pfizer is the only company that for which funding went solely to procurement, but the magnitude of the funding that went to Pfizer looks like it's similar in the magnitude of the funding that went to other companies, except this one company for which I think funding was only for development. I forget what.
Merck for 38 million.
So is that to imply that most of the funding that was distributed through BARDA was just for procurement? So we're kind of overestimating BARDA's role in the innovation side of things here. And then second point is, how do these contracts work? Is the funding like delivered in advance? So some of it is directed toward innovation, or is it, I don't know the structure, and students were wondering as well.
Yeah, I wish I had a good answer to that. I mean, it's not that I'm lazy. I mean, I've spent time staring at these contracts, and lawyers have as well. It's not quite clear. So I think your instinct is an interesting one, which is to look at the variation across size and categories and try to say what's going for what. One thing I didn't show you is I'm kind of rolling up all of the BARDA contracts into one row, partly to make this slide. But there's a series of contracts, right? And so it's usually the last contract that's typically called Mod 2 or Mod 3 that is for procurement for obvious reasons. So I think just the Pfizer procurement contract was much bigger than the other procurement contracts. And I think that might have to do with bargaining power, that might have to do with perceived value, I don't know. But yeah, so but there is quite a bit of money for pure push as well. It does, independent of the procurement contracts, that doesn't show up in the chart that I showed you because I didn't disaggregate it, but it's a good eye. It's a good eye, yeah. And in terms of when it's delivered, that's the part where I don't actually know. I don't actually know, and I may at some point learn this, but I haven't been able to figure all that out yet. Yeah, so, but not for lack of trying.
So I actually benefited from BARDA for an Ebola test back in 2016, and it was done during the development. So not the fundamental research. At a point where the test was already, we assumed that it was working, then BARDA helped to get the test to Guinea and make sure that it actually worked with samples as it was supposed to. So I don't know whether that answers the question, but I don't think that they do fundamental research. Maybe with COVID, they didn't have a choice. Maybe with COVID, they didn't have a choice. So since I have the floor, I have a quick question about price and the ethics of it. Or procurement, I should say. So the United States, you pointed out justly, actually contributed mostly to the research, right, for new vaccines. So is there really like an ethical part that says that because the US paid for most of it, it makes sense that the US citizen benefit from it more? Or are there organisms or organizations that are looking and saying, you know what, we are part of a global community and it's a global pandemic. And yes, you participated, you're also the richest country. So it should be distributed evenly, doesn't matter how much you contributed. And as a follow-up question, do we actually know how much the procurement is? Or is it possible that Pfizer produces secretly some doses that they don't account for that would then, I don't know, be given to the US instead of distributed worldwide?
I don't know the answer to your last question. I don't know the answer to your first question. I mean, other than to say that, I mean, I'm not a global, I'm sure that there are global ethical frameworks. I mean, I'm not a global justice person. I'm sure there are ethical frameworks that would argue for both. There's also ethical frameworks that, you know, health is a human right, and or, you know, you could come up with economic frameworks where these are infectious diseases, and, you know, in some sense, you need to knock them out everywhere. And so, yeah, I hear the argument, but the first that you made, that the U.S. contributed the most, so it should get the most, I'm sure that that's appealing to a lot of people. Not myself, but I'm sure that's appealing to a lot of people as well. Yeah. So, yeah.
So I have a question here from another person in our audience group. The question actually is, so it relates to things we've already been discussing, but the question is directed at Jeff. But I think Bhaven and maybe the rest of us would have some comment, but I am curious what Jeff thinks about this. I'll just read it, but then I'll get, you know, the translation is pretty clear. Wouldn't this be an opportunity for the UN to get an agreement signed by countries in order for the vaccine to be considered a public good? I mean, that's basically what I think COVAX is about. But another thing that can be done is to start raising the issues about production distribution with developing countries, and this can be an opportunity to develop distribution protocols and strategies. That also is really what we're talking about, at least partly with COVAX and also the compulsory licensing. But maybe Jeff first. I don't know, Jeff, what your thought? You're a lot closer to that, the UN system, and what you think, and then Bhaven and Giannis and Andrew may have thoughts too.
Yeah, this is certainly the idea of WHO and COVAX, that this is a global public good and a global arrangement. The US just doesn't sign on. And as you remember, the US pulled out of the World Health Organization. So this is part of US politics. Biden will return us to WHO. He may well join COVAX as an initial move. From a geopolitical point of view, China has joined COVAX. China will have a working vaccine probably before the United States. It's already inoculated probably millions and millions of people with the vaccine that they have. We haven't heard a report of it, but there's a mass inoculation effort already underway of what's called their frontline workers. I don't know the details of it. Maybe Bhaven knows more. But my friends in China tell me that a lot of people are already inoculated and that it's already being rolled out. So I expect China to be in the lead, actually, both on production, distribution, geopolitics next year, if their vaccine works. And it seems that most of these vaccines work, at least in the short term, to produce neutralizing antibodies. So, and probably, if I understand correctly, China's vaccine platforms are much more conventional and don't need a -70°C cold chain. So I think the interesting fact is we're going to see China playing a very visible leadership role in 2021, and the US will be scrambling, and under Biden, I think will be both cooperative and trying to get the US back into the deal on this. That would be my guess. Under Trump, you know, the whole point was that I thought Yanis was channeling Trump a couple of minutes ago. We paid for it, it's ours. And most of the other 7.5 billion people in the world don't see it that way.
That's not my point of view. I was just...
I understand. But I do think that because China's likely to have one or more efficacious vaccines, I think this will be a major geopolitical event in the coming months.
So it is, it is a backsliding that, as I think was mentioned in one of the earlier webinars, the U.S. provided leadership, but also partnership with the Soviet Union to eradicate smallpox, which was a gift for the whole world.
Yep.
And a tremendous achievement. And
isn't it true, by the way, Scott, since you know more about this than anyone on the planet, that the U.S. initially was skeptical of the smallpox eradication, and the Soviets actually pushed more, and then the U.S. came along afterwards? At least that's how I remember the story.
Yeah, there was skepticism about it, and from what I remember, D.A. Henderson, who the American public health expert, who had been advocating for U.S. donations for measles vaccine, because the way these things happen, President Johnson wanted some way to do something for some international year of something. Right. It was some he needed to do something.
And a UN something.
Yeah, well, right. Not UN, US thing. Really, it was US. It was
no. But I mean, US wanted to do something because the UN had named some year for something.
Right. Exactly. And Henderson, who's an extraordinary man, he fed that system with his proposal that we do it. Measles, and then he said, while we're doing measles, let's do smallpox. Oh. And then later, he had a very powerful personality. I think amazing man. And later, he was put in charge of the eradication effort, but not everyone thought he was going to be successful. Right. And there's no question that with something like that, you never know how it's going to turn out, right? So it's really something. It has to be worth doing, even if it doesn't succeed, right? You have to think of it that way. Mm. And but looking back on it, it's been this amazing success, and it is just very disturbing that after the collapse of the Soviet Union and all these years, you would have thought that there would be more solidarity than there was in the height of the Cold War, and more of a belief that we can do more together than by this, unilateralism, nationalism, as Bhaven said, this vaccine nationalism. So I think the world is sliding in the wrong direction.
It is not paradoxical in the sense that in the Cold War, there was also a competition for hearts and minds, whereas after 1992, one country, our own, thought, well, we're the best and the greatest, so we don't have to compete for hearts and minds anymore.
Yeah, but you were just saying if China.
No, but now it's going to come back to that.
Yeah. But I think I think we're going to look back on this as a real missed opportunity, because the U.S. Needs the rest of the world, and it's not just a one-way street. And I think it's a major loss for the United States. And anyway, it's.
But Scott, you're speaking in the past tense, and you've studied this certainly more than I have. I mean, I view this, right, like, this is not even the end of the beginning, let alone the beginning of the end. And in some sense, I mean, what about you studied global public goods more than anyone else, and what about the argument that there is an enlightened self-interest argument to Americans here that we're losing international influence and whatnot? Is that an appealing argument to, say, U.S. taxpayers, U.S. politicians at this point?
Yeah, I think so. But I think you make there are two levels. There's the moral case, first of all, which I think in terms of communication is very powerful and unifying. And then there's the other case, which is that there is a kind of self-interest aspect to this, as there often is and has to be. But it's not all very explicit and quantifiable, I would say. But it's also true. It's also true that this disease spreads globally. And I think the cost to the U.S. of acting would be low. Once you've done the big cost is on the development side. Once you have the vaccine, normally you would expect production to be relatively inexpensive. And so it really wouldn't be that, I mean, look, I mean, compared to our defense spending, you know, in terms of having an impact of US security, this would be much greater impact. So I think this has to do with the mindset. And this America First thing is a mindset. And once you're locked into that, you're just not open to broader perspectives that can be very valuable. So I think we'll look at this as a lost opportunity. I think Biden can do some things, but he'll need Congress for funding.
Bhaven, and another thing you might look at on the trail of this is the politics of using BARDA versus NIH. It's probably the case that the White House, after they kicked out the BARDA head,
Right, yeah.
that they felt that basically BARDA was theirs. They put in a company lobbyist, and I think probably they felt BARDA was the way to work with the companies without any of the peskiness of institutional oversight. That Tony Fauci, played by rules, NIH played by rules, but once Scott Bright, I guess his name is, the whistleblower was thrown out of BARDA, they owned that channel, and probably it's there's just a direct corporate lack of oversight. I mean, ability to push things through, for whether it's for the good reason or the bad reason, but in other words, just an internal bureaucratic play, whereas NIH would be Rick Bright, that it would be too hard to do it through NIH channels.
Yep. Yeah, I think learning about that will be interesting. And my instinct is just as yours. I think that's exactly right. But I also think, it's just like having two thoughts in your mind at the same time. I also think NIH wouldn't have been very good at this. I don't think they, institutionally, I don't think NIH is set up to do this kind of stuff.
Could have gone as fast, for example.
Yeah. And so I think it's a complicated story and remains to be told.
Yeah. Good. Well, you'll tell it. That's great.
You'll tell it. And you've already told us where we are right now. I mean, what an exciting journey. And you took us right through it and helped us to understand it. So I'm very grateful to you. Really great presentation, Bhaven.
Fantastic.
And keep up the great work. And let's all stay in touch. So thanks so much, everybody. Great to see you all.
Thanks all. Really enjoyed this.
Thank you.
Thank you all very much. Nice meeting you.
Great. Thanks so much,
Bye.
Bhaven. Fantastic.